For centuries, this fortress was the seat of an ancient and malevolent power, a power that lay in wait for centuries, unnoticed by most. Though its history remains cloaked in darkness, its influence ripples through the very fabric of Middle-earth, even in the Third Age. To most, Dol Guldur is simply a name, a forgotten shadow of the past. But those who dare to speak of it speak in hushed tones, their voices carrying the weight of a history filled with terror. What is the true nature of this fortress? What horrors once lingered behind its dark walls? The common tales tell us that Dol Guldur was the dwelling of Sauron, the necromancer, long before he openly declared himself as the Dark Lord. It was here that his power first began to grow, his influence slowly seeping into the land. But few know of the darker secrets that lay within its confines. The fortress was not simply a place where Sauron's presence lingered. It was a breeding ground for horrors that would shape the fate of Middle-earth in ways few could have anticipated. The creeping darkness that emanated from Dol Guldur would forever alter the history of Mirkwood, and the free peoples of Middle-earth would pay the price for generations to come. This is the story of Dol Guldur, of the sinister forces that festered within its walls, and of the horrors that lay hidden for centuries. We will journey into the heart of that shadow, uncovering the mysteries that history has buried. What truly happened within the fortress? Why did its very name inspire such fear, even in the bravest hearts? The story that follows will pull back the veil of time, revealing the terrifying truth of what lay within Dol Guldur and the dark influence it had over the world. What began as a fortress in the heart of Mirkwood would soon become the seed from which the greatest evil of Middle-earth would bloom. The story begins long before the fortress's ruin, in the quiet peace of Mirkwood before it was poisoned by darkness. But even then, something stirred in the deep places, something old and twisted, ready to rise and take root once more. The tale begins with the construction of Dol Guldur, a fortress shrouded in mystery from its very inception. Its origins, though unclear to many, were as dark as the forest it was built upon. The necromancer, who would later come to be known as Sauron, chose this place for its isolation, hidden away in the depths of Mirkwood. In those days, the land was still rich with ancient trees, untouched by the darkness that would soon fall upon it. The woods were alive with the sounds of nature, birds singing in the canopy, the rustle of leaves, the gentle flow of rivers. But beneath the surface, a deep unease began to creep into the land. As the necromancer began to weave dark enchantments into the very foundation of the fortress, the land began to change. Mirkwood, once a place of beauty, slowly began to lose its vibrancy, the trees darkening, the wildlife growing fewer. A malevolent presence lingered in the air, unseen but deeply felt. The peace of the woodland was no more. What had once been serene living forest became a place of chilling silence, broken only by the whispers of shadows and the low rumble of distant thunder. The air grew thick with a sense of foreboding, as if something was watching, waiting, from the very depths of the forest. The elves of Mirkwood, led by Thranduil, were the first to feel the growing power of the necromancer. They had long lived in the shadows of the forest, their kingdom nestled within the trees. Thranduil, wise and vigilant, immediately recognized that something was amiss. His people had lived in harmony with nature for centuries, and the creeping change in Mirkwood did not go unnoticed. At first, it was subtle, strange creatures wandering too close to their borders, whispers in the wind, and flickers of shadow in places where light should have been. But soon, these signs grew stronger, more dangerous. Thranduil's kingdom began to feel the weight of the presence within Dol Guldur. The once vibrant forest was now filled with a quiet terror, a looming threat that none could fully understand. The elves had long been aware of the darker powers in the world, but this was different. This was something far older and far more insidious, something that could not be easily defeated with swords or arrows. The darkness spreading from Dol Guldur was not something that could be seen with the eyes alone. It was something that gnawed at the soul, something that infected the very land. At first, Thranduil and his people tried to keep their distance, to avoid confronting the growing evil that crept across Mirkwood. But as the corruption spread, it became impossible to ignore. The elves began to notice the disappearance of creatures they had once shared the forest with. Deer, birds, rabbits, all simply vanished without a trace. Strange, twisted creatures began to emerge from the depths of the forest, creatures that seemed to be born from the very shadows of Dol Guldur. They were unlike any animals the elves had encountered before, foul, corrupted beings that left behind an unmistakable mark of evil. Thranduil's people, once proud and strong, were now beset by fear, and the once prosperous kingdom of Mirkwood began to fall into decline. The land was no longer safe, and even the elves, with all their grace and wisdom, could not stem the tide of corruption. The whispers of Dol Guldur reached the deepest parts of the kingdom, sowing distrust among the elves and driving them further into isolation. Thranduil, though wise, could not keep the full extent of the growing threat from his people. The fortress was a black stain upon the forest, and its very presence seemed to corrupt everything around it. As the darkness from Dol Guldur spread, it became clear that the elves of Mirkwood could not confront this evil alone. They had always been a proud and independent people, but the forces gathering in Dol Guldur were too great, too vast. The first steps toward the eventual defeat of this evil began in the hearts of those who understood the true danger it posed. Gandalf, a wanderer in Middle-earth at the time, would come to play a crucial role in uncovering the nature of the force that had taken root in the His growing suspicion of the necromancer's identity would set the stage for the greater battle to come, a battle that would ultimately change the fate of Middle-earth forever. But that was still to come. For now, the land of Mirkwood remained in shadow, with only the quiet rustle of trees and the distant whispers of doom to mark the passage of time. The fortress of Dol Guldur stood as a dark sentinel, its true nature still shrouded in mystery, its power only beginning to be felt across the world. The evil within was growing, and with it, the fear that something far worse than simple shadows had begun to take shape. As the land continued to change, so too did the hearts of those who felt its pull. Thranduil's decision to keep his kingdom isolated, to not confront the dark force head-on, would prove to be a fateful one. It was a decision that would carry consequences that rippled throughout Middle-earth, the effects of which would be felt long after the shadows had retreated from the fortress. The first signs of the horrors that would come were already in motion. The slow transformation of Mirkwood had only just begun, and the greater struggle for Middle-earth's soul was yet to unfold. And as the dark figure known only as the necromancer continued to weave his schemes from within the walls of Dol Guldur, the people of Middle-earth could only wait and wonder if they would ever truly be free of the darkness that now stretched its fingers toward them. Gandalf's journey through Middle-earth had led him down many paths, but none as dark as the one he was now walking. The shadow of Dol Guldur hung heavy in the air, its oppressive presence seeping into the land of Mirkwood. As he traveled, the once vibrant woods seemed to grow quieter, the rustling leaves now muffled under the weight of an ancient, unseen terror. The closer he got to Dol Guldur, the more his sense of unease deepened. The whispers he heard in the wind, the flickering shadows in the corners of his vision, these were no mere tricks of the light. Something was stirring in the heart of Mirkwood, something that had remained hidden for far too long. Gandalf had heard tales of the necromancer, a dark sorcerer who had taken residence in the fortress of Dol Guldur. At first, these tales seemed like nothing more than old legends, frightening stories told around campfires to warn children. But as Gandalf ventured deeper into the forest, he began to sense the growing power that radiated from the fortress. It was no longer just a distant whisper. It was a presence, an unmistakable force that gnawed at his very being. The land itself seemed corrupted, its natural beauty tainted by an unseen hand. Gandalf's investigations took him further into Mirkwood, where he encountered more and more signs of the necromancer's growing influence. Strange occurrences began to plague the land. Once familiar creatures, now twisted by an unnatural darkness, prowled the woods. Giant spiders, monstrous and foul, crept through the trees, their venomous fangs glistening in the moonlight. In the silence of the night, the eerie sounds of distant cries could be heard. But when Gandalf searched for the source, he found nothing anything Gandalf had ever encountered. The people of Mirkwood, led by Thranduil, were aware of the growing evil that had taken root in their land, but they were powerless to stop it. Thranduil, wise and proud, had long kept his people isolated, hidden deep within the forest, but even his formidable knowledge could not fully explain the nature of the darkness that crept from Dol Guldur. He knew something terrible stirred in the fortress, but he could not confront it directly. The elves of Mirkwood, with all their grace and power, could not bring themselves to challenge the dark sorcerer who called Dol Guldur home. They were too few, too divided, and their strength had been sapped by the weight of centuries. Gandalf, however, was not one to shy away from confrontation. As his investigation deepened, he encountered more than just physical manifestations of the necromancer's power. There were whispers, low, sibilant voices that seemed to come from nowhere. He could feel them at the edges of his mind, clawing at his thoughts, urging him to turn back. These were not mere shadows. They were the whispers of the dead, the lost souls who had fallen under the necromancer's thrall. And as the days passed, they grew louder, more insistent. But it was not until Gandalf sought counsel with the White Council that the full extent of the necromancer's power became clear. Elrond, Galadriel, and the others gathered in secret, their faces grave as they discussed the growing threat in Mirkwood. The council had long suspected that the necromancer was no ordinary sorcerer, but even they had not known the full truth. As Gandalf spoke of his discoveries, the unnatural creatures, the twisted land, the whispers of the dead, he saw the fear in their eyes. They, too, had known of the darkness spreading from Dol Guldur, but they had not understood its true nature. It was in this moment of shared understanding that the truth began to take shape. Gandalf's suspicions, which had been growing since his first steps into Mirkwood, were confirmed. The necromancer was none other than Sauron himself, returned to Middle-earth in secret, hiding his power behind the guise of a mere sorcerer. The Dark Lord's influence had already begun to spread, infecting the hearts of men and elves alike, sowing fear, distrust, and confusion. And as Sauron's power continued to grow, so did the darkness that seeped from Dol Guldur. Gandalf's heart sank as the weight of this revelation hit him. The fortress, once thought to be a mere stronghold of evil, was now revealed to be the very heart of Sauron's resurgence in Middle-earth. The horror of it was undeniable. Sauron had been hiding in plain sight, manipulating the world from the shadows, gathering strength while the free peoples remained unaware. The full scope of his plans began to unfold before Gandalf's eyes, and the stakes of their struggle became painfully clear. Sauron was no longer a distant threat. He was here, in Middle-earth, and his power was growing. As Gandalf began to piece together the truth about Dol Guldur and the necromancer's true identity, he could not help but feel a deep sense of foreboding. The discovery of the Ringreds and their connection to Sauron's power only strengthened his resolve. The wraiths, once men, now bound to Sauron's will, were the harbingers of doom, silent, relentless, and all-consuming. Their presence was a sign of the darkness that was coming, and Gandalf knew that if they were not stopped, the entire world would fall under Sauron's dominion. But despite this growing urgency, Gandalf could not shake the feeling of helplessness that plagued him. His powers, though formidable, were no match for the growing shadow of Sauron. How could he, a lone wizard, stand against a dark lord who had manipulated the very fabric of Middle-earth for centuries? The pressure weighed heavily on Gandalf's shoulders, and the growing fear that his efforts would not be enough gnawed at him constantly. The realization that this was only the beginning of a far greater conflict filled him with dread. And yet, he knew there was no turning back. The stakes could not be clearer. Gandalf, along with the White Council, knew that they had to act, but their options were limited. Dol Guldur was not only a physical fortress, it was a symbol of Sauron's power, his ability to corrupt and control from the shadows. The very land itself was tainted by his presence, and every day they delayed, Sauron's grip on Middle-earth grew stronger. As Gandalf left the meeting of the council, the weight of their collective decision hung heavily on him. There was no time to waste. The enemy was no longer a distant force, an abstract evil lurking in the background. It was here, in the heart of Mirkwood, and it was only a matter of time before it spread beyond the forest, threatening to engulf all of Middle-earth. The mystery of Dol Guldur had been revealed, but the true battle was only just beginning. The journey ahead was uncertain, filled with peril and uncertainty. But Gandalf understood now that there was no other choice. He could not turn away from the darkness. He had to confront it, no matter the cost. The path was clear, but the road ahead was fraught with danger, and Gandalf would need all his wisdom, strength, and resolve to stand against the shadow that threatened to consume Middle-earth. The shadows had only just begun to stir. As Gandalf prepared to face the horrors of Dol Guldur, the weight of his past and the future of Middle-earth rested heavily on his shoulders. The battle for the soul of Middle-earth was not just one of might, but of will, of light against the encroaching dark. And as the Dark Lord's forces gathered strength, Gandalf knew that only through unity and courage could the free peoples of Middle-earth stand a chance against the overwhelming power that Sauron sought to unleash. The air of Mirkwood seemed to shift, as though it had taken a deep, hesitant breath, exhaling the oppressive weight that had hung over it for so long. Sauron's retreat from Dol Guldur was a victory, yes, but one tempered with a deep, gnawing sorrow. The fortress, though abandoned for the moment, had left behind scars far beyond its physical walls. The trees of Mirkwood, once proud and green, were now twisted and shrunken, their leaves darkened as if the very life of the forest had been drained. The creatures that once called it home had become strange, distorted reflections of their former selves, spiders that grew larger, more venomous, more malignant. Beasts that once roamed freely now cowered in the shadows, or attacked with a ferocity that spoke to something darker inside them. The people of Mirkwood, the elves who had lived for centuries in the shelter of the trees, were also irrevocably changed. Thranduil, their king, could no longer ignore the cost of his kingdom's isolation, nor the painful truth that his people had been nearly consumed by the darkness they had allowed to fester in their midst. For years, they had remained aloof, hidden deep within the forest, too proud to seek help, too stubborn to confront the growing shadow that threatened their very existence. Now, with the truth laid bare before them, Thranduil found himself burdened with the weight of that decision, his heart heavy with regret. He had allowed his kingdom to sleep through the storm, and in doing so, had allowed his people to become pawns in a game far beyond their understanding. As Gandalf stood upon the edge of the ruined forest, the silence was deafening. The battle had been won, but the cost was not easily counted in lives lost or battles fought. The victory over Sauron's influence in Dol Guldur had been important, yes, but it had not been decisive. Sauron was not gone. He had simply retreated, hidden once more in the shadows, biding his time. The land had been corrupted, the very earth poisoned by the evil that had taken root within it. It would take years, perhaps even centuries, for the land to recover. And even then, the scars would remain, a reminder of the power that had once been. Gandalf's heart was heavy as he walked through the forest, his thoughts consumed by the events that had unfolded. The weight of leadership had fallen to him, and while the burden was not one he had sought, it was one he could not escape. The free peoples of Middle-earth had come together to face Sauron, but their unity was fragile, and the dangers that lay ahead were still unknown. The shadow of Dol Guldur had not been fully banished. It still lingered in the hearts of those who had been touched by its darkness. Thranduil, though now more open to the possibility of cooperation with other races, remained wary. The elves of Mirkwood would never forget the toll that isolation had taken on them. Gandalf's internal reflection was a painful one. He had seen the horrors that had unfolded in Dol Guldur, but he also knew that the true struggle had only just begun. His role as a guide and protector had only deepened. The people of Middle-earth were not yet ready to face the full extent of Sauron's power. They were still divided, still clinging to their old fears and prejudices. If they were to survive the darkness, they would need to come together in ways they had never done before. But Gandalf could not help but wonder if that unity could truly be forged. The darkness of Dol Guldur had shown him just how fragile the alliances of Middle-earth were. How many more times would they need to be tested before they broke under the strain? His thoughts were interrupted low rustle in the trees. The forest, still mourning its corruption, seemed to whisper secrets to him, fragments of a past that had long been forgotten. The darkness that had settled in Dol Guldur had not only been physical, it had been psychological, too. The elves had been scarred by it, their once proud hearts now filled with doubt. Thranduil, too, felt the weight of this darkness. He had always known of the shadows in the world, but this was different. This was a shadow that had taken root in his own land, in his own kingdom. The very foundation of his people had been shaken, and he could no longer pretend that they could survive in isolation. Gandalf knew the price of leadership was not just in battle or strategy. It was in understanding the deep scars that the heart bore. As he moved through the forest, the faces of those he had met, the faces of those who had fought, sacrificed, and suffered came to mind. The battle for Middle-earth was not one that could be won by force alone. The struggle against Sauron was as much about the soul of the free peoples as it was about the physical realm. The unity Gandalf sought to inspire was not one of armies or alliances, but of shared understanding and strength of heart. But that unity could only come if the people of Middle-earth were willing to confront the darkness within themselves. As Gandalf left the ruined forest, he cast one final glance at Dol Guldur. The fortress, now abandoned, still loomed on the horizon. It was a symbol of the darkness that had threatened to consume the world, but it was also a reminder that the fight was far from over. Sauron's power had been diminished, but the evil that had once dwelled there would never truly fade. The land might recover, the trees might regrow, but the scars of Dol Guldur would remain. Gandalf understood this better than anyone. The battle against Sauron was not over. The darkness would return in new forms, in new guises. The world of Middle-earth would never be free of it, and neither would Gandalf. The toll of Dol Guldur in the end was not one of death and destruction. It was one of change. The very heart of Middle-earth had been shaken, and in that shaking, a new understanding had been born. The people of Middle-earth had seen the darkness in its rawest form, and they would never be the same again. Gandalf's role in this was far from over. He had helped bring them together once, but he knew it would take far more than a single victory to unite them against the dark power that still threatened them. As Gandalf prepared to leave Mirkwood behind, he reflected on the lessons he had learned, the weight of leadership,